And thank you.
Okay,
Cool.
thank you.
All right. Well, it is my great pleasure to introduce Sally Hurst from the Found a Fossil Project. So Sally's visiting us, I guess, via Lightning Ridge as well, so you have to tell us all about that. So I couldn't see you this morning, I was quite busy. But she's visiting us via Lightning Ridge to come and talk to us about her master's project that she's doing through Macquarie University. And it crosses two great disciplines, paleontology and also archaeology as well. So I won't go into too much detail, I'll let Sally do that. But do stick around for questions at the end if you're in the room and also on Zoom as well. Thanks, Sally.
Great, thank you. Okay, so first off, thank you guys for coming and thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here. So to tell you a little bit about my Found a Fossil project. Now, before I launch in, I do want to acknowledge that we're all on Aboriginal land, wherever we are in Australia. And I also want to extend that respect to the fact that without the amazing care and connection of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, many of the incredible natural sites, cultural sites and fossil sites we have in Australia, they wouldn't be here without that care and preservation by Indigenous peoples. So to set the stage a little bit, I'll just tell you a bit about me. So I grew up on a very small farm near Gunning, New South Wales. It's halfway between Goulburn and Canberra. And I loved dinosaurs as a kid, and I eventually moved to Sydney to do my Bachelor of Science in Paleobiology and a Bachelor of Arts in Egyptian Archaeology. And at the moment I am doing my Masters of Research also at Macquarie. It says paleontology there, but as Marissa said, it's also archaeology, science communication, community engagement, and about 17 other things. And I'm also an education presenter at the Australian Museum. And as well as those two things, I work with a bunch of other companies doing mentoring, science communication, science engagement kind of activities. And it's been the combination of working with all of these different groups that has led to my passion for this engagement with the public and the community about history, about science, and especially using storytelling as a tool to engage different audiences. And speaking of stories, I do have one for you now. So I want you all to imagine that you are somewhere just like this. Maybe you're out on a bushwalk or you're in the field and you've tripped over something. Now, when you look behind you to have a look at what you tripped over, your first thought is that this is the bone of a bloody big cow. Now, you take a closer look and it is not the bone of a cow, it is something a bit more special, and it is the bone of a dinosaur. Now, you may laugh at this story a bit, but this is exactly how our Australian dinosaurs, Muttaburrasaurus, Winternotitan, Australotitan, and many others were discovered. Fossils and Indigenous artefacts are not often found by scientists, but instead by farmers, miners, bushwalkers, and beyond. So if it was you that had discovered a fossil or an Indigenous artefact, what would you do with it? Who might you tell about your discovery? Would you tell your colleagues here at university? Would you put it on display at your house, bring it out at dinner parties and show your friends? Would you bother telling anyone at all? And unfortunately, the answer is that we have no idea what happens to this heritage material once it's discovered. And so the glaring question is the heritage material of Australia actually being protected and preserved? Now, it's a bit of a tricky situation. In Australia more generally, fossils and Indigenous artefacts are covered by the Protection of Movable Cultural Heritage Act of 1986. Now, while this act does an okay-ish job of keeping things in the country, so it regulates the import and export of fossils, Indigenous artefacts and other heritage items, it doesn't actually have any information on how to handle things within the country. So there's no rules on buying or selling, there's no rules on reporting or what you do if you actually discover something. So a decidedly unhelpful piece of legislation. More specifically in New South Wales, currently both fossils and Indigenous artefacts and sites are covered under the National Parks and Life Act of 1974. So it's rather outdated by now. For things like Aboriginal artefacts, there is a current new Aboriginal Cultural Heritage Bill which has been drafted. It's been in that draft stage since 2018, and we're still waiting for something to happen. But for Indigenous artefacts and sites, it is a legal requirement to report any new discoveries. However, that is very much up to the discretion of landholders or miners to actually report that material. Now, the body who governs this in New South Wales is Heritage New South Wales. So you're meant to report any finds that you have to them, but it's not quite as easy as it seems. When I started doing press for this project, I had a farmer contact me from a small farm outside of Sydney, and he said that he thought he had found some Aboriginal grindstones, which were potentially several thousand years old. He wanted to return them to the local Aboriginal community, but he had no idea of how to do that, and could I help him? So I thought this was a great way to kind of practice how this process might actually go for a farmer. So I rang the Heritage New South Wales General Inquiries line, told them the situation. We've got some Aboriginal artefacts. I know that you are the body who we are meant to report to. What are my next steps? And the answer was, that is a really good question. Are you sure it's us where you're meant to be talking to? Let me get back to you. And then inevitably, no one got back to me. So it took me literal days to scan through just about every single web page and sub-page on the Heritage New South Wales website to find a tiny little email address shoved in the corner saying that this is a person you can go to for more information. Once I emailed that person, and I think it is a department of one, he was absolutely lovely and very helpful, but it very much seemed that the entirety of Heritage New South Wales, like many other government institutions, are really struggling with being underfunded and under-resourced. So this person, he mentioned that it's usually about a 10-day turnaround just to reply to an email about you found something. Then actually getting an archaeologist or Indigenous person to get onto a property to confirm that it is or isn't an Indigenous authentic site or object can be weeks. And he actually asked me if I was qualified to go to this person's farm and say that yes, they are or aren't Indigenous artefacts. It's like, you sound like you know what you're doing. Can you just go? And I'm like, definitely not qualified for that, but I put him in contact with this farmer and he has since helped to kind of kickstart that process. But if you didn't have a me, if you were just a farmer trying to Google, I found an artefact in New South Wales, what do I do? Who can I call? It would be very difficult to actually find the right information, and I'm not surprised that so many things likely aren't getting reported just because it takes so long to actually comb through this. And again, having a degree in paleontology, archaeology, I'm very familiar with a lot of the jargon and technical language used, even on these public websites. But again, if you are a farmer who has no familiarity with these different terms, it just makes it all the more difficult to access this information. Now, for fossils, it's not much better. Fossils kind of sit in a weird grey area that no one knows if they kind of count as important cultural artefacts similar to archaeological material, or if they count more towards the minerals and gems. So do you need a mining license? Do you need a scientific license? Do you need anything at all? No one really knows. And so in Australia, this Act in New South Wales, this Act specifies that if you are in a national park, don't destroy anything, don't take anything with you, including fossil material. But if it's outside of a national park or reserve, it's pretty much free game. So if you are a farmer or a miner, you've dug up a brand new dinosaur species, there is no legal requirement to report it to anyone. So paleontologists very much rely on the goodwill of the community, of these farmers and miners coming forward and saying, I've got something pretty cool I'd like to show you. And we wouldn't be able to do half the research that we have without the involvement of these parts of the community. But unfortunately, in these conversations about heritage conservation and legislation, people like farmers and the general public are very rarely included in this discourse. But hopefully, the Found a Fossil project is going to change that a little bit. So my project has three main aims. The first is to find out what Australians think about the discovery and protection of fossils and Indigenous artefacts. As I've outlined, the legislation is pretty dodgy, so hopefully I can use the data that I collect to outline these problems in the legislation and provide solutions for state heritage departments for better legislation communication, just making the resources that are already there much more accessible to everyone. And the third goal is to create a big accessible resource for all of this heritage information for every single state of Australia. So a big central portal, so you don't have to comb through the New South Wales websites and the Queensland ones. It's all just together. So to go towards addressing the first aim of figuring out what people think, I have released an Australia-wide survey that is open to every single person over the age of 10. So it opened in January and it closes at the end of June. So if you haven't done it already, please do. And if you can share it with your networks as well, that would be muchly appreciated. At the moment, I am especially looking to reach out to more Indigenous people and more farmers. Again, these are two key groups whose perspectives are really important in this space, and I want to make sure that they are represented really well. You can see that the survey has quite a few different sections. So there's partly one on demographics, fossil finds, Indigenous artefact finds, heritage laws, and science communication. Now, I know this probably looks like a lot, but I've designed it in a good way, so the whole survey should only take you about 6 to 8 minutes to complete. And while doing talks like this is a great way to promote the survey, I have posted in about 140 individual Facebook community groups. This was pretty tough because every single community group generally comes with its own security questions, which is everything from what postcode do you live in to what is a drop bear. So it took some time, but that was actually one of the most effective ways of getting to different parts of the community all around Australia. I sent over 160 individual emails to different government departments, land care groups. I contacted every single local Aboriginal land council I could find an email address for, geological societies and more. And using sponsored posts on social media as well has definitely helped to bump up participation as well. So that's most of my digital marketing, but I've been able to do many other things which are a lot more fun. So I've gone on radio quite a few times. If I'm ever travelling around the countryside, I'll generally contact the radio station of the town that I am in and be like, I'm doing cool things with fossils, do you want to talk about it? So these are a few. I also did one at Lightning Ridge a month ago on their community radio, which was an experience. Speaking of travelling around the country, so in February I did a big New South Wales road trip. So I went to Canowindra for the Age of Fishes Museum, Wellington Caves, Lightning Ridge for the Opal Centre. The picture of me with a cow was actually at Canberra Show. So my sister, she's a cattle photographer, because that's a job you can have apparently. And she introduced me to a lot of her farming friends who I got to do the survey, which was really good. More recently, I got to work at the Australian Museum as part of their annual Dinosaur Festival. So we had over 40,000 people come through the museum over 6 days during the Easter school holidays. I was working all 6 of those days and I did, I think, 5 back-to-back shows every single day. But the museum was great because in some of those presentations they did let me plug my survey and talk about my research and explain to all of these kids down the front, if you find a fossil, 1, what would you name the dinosaur? And 2, what should you actually do if you discover something? And just last week I actually had a an article published on me in Outback Magazine. So using many, many different channels to try and reach out to lots of different parts of the community in promotion of this project and survey. Now, some preliminary results from the survey. So as of this morning, I had 917 people who had completed the survey. Of this number, one of the main questions I was asking was, if you did actually find a fossil or an Indigenous artefact, would you tell anyone? And we can see that overwhelmingly people were saying yes. Everyone who did the survey was also asked what might stop you from telling someone about a find. And the overwhelming answers, first one was, it may not be a significant find, so why bother telling anyone? And the second one was that they had no idea who they were meant to contact. And so that is backed up by this. There's a lot going on here, but the main thing to take away is that who the people or who the institutions that people are contacting about fossil finds or Indigenous finds are incredibly varied. And again, this comes back to the poor communication of legislation and who you are actually supposed to contact as why this is so varied. If, again, there was a central resource and this information was more accessible, I'd expect to see many less categories here. So the good news is that for fossil finds, about 35% of people are saying that they would contact a museum. That's exactly what we like to hear. Some of the other sections on here, so the light grey section are universities, the dark grey section is a known paleontologist or scientist, and the darker blue section is parks and wildlife, which was quite interesting, and then a few other smaller things like social media, local council, and your state heritage body. So again, we would like to see that museum and university sections increase quite a bit. But again, because it's not really covered under any legislation right now, this one could probably be quite a bit harder to convey information about who you can contact. For Indigenous artefact finds, we can see that 35% of people are contacting their local Indigenous community. Now, I think this is great because local Indigenous communities and local communities in general are going to have a much higher care factor of anything that's found in that area compared to state governments. I feel for state governments, if they are already underfunded and under-resourced, for them it's going to be a headache. They're going to go, oh God, something else I need to write a report on. Whereas if it's a local community grassroots approach, it's quite exciting. It's stories about your local area and the history about where you live. So I feel that it's pretty good that people are contacting their local Indigenous communities. However, we can see this yellow slice over here. This is the 10% of people who said that they would actually contact their state heritage body, who in every state, that's who legally you are required to contact. So again, that really big knowledge gap of who you are supposed to contact, what you're supposed to do, is becoming very, very apparent. Now, this 10% of people who make up this slice, I actually have a feeling that a lot of this is made up of heritage consultants and professionals who have done my survey, which, love the participation. But for people who are not familiar with this material, I suspect that that number would be a lot lower. So again, this is a nice way to prove to the state heritage companies and governments that their communication strategies are not working or non-existent. This knowledge gap is further backed up by this question. So people were asked to react to the statement, I feel confident that any existing laws in my state adequately protect fossils or Indigenous artefacts. And 75% of participants said that they disagreed with that statement, so they are not confident that the laws are adequate, or they don't know enough about the laws to say that they are adequate or not, which is pretty scary. And again, this just goes to show that a lot of our heritage material likely isn't being reported, and so it's not being protected. So to address this knowledge gap, I created the Found a Fossil website. So this also goes into that third aim of the project of creating a holistic, accessible resource. And so the three main sections, we have the laws for fossil finds and laws for Indigenous finds. These sections contain a state-by-state breakdown of what legislation and act applies in your state, who you can contact for more information, and other resources and contacts for fossil identifications, who your state museum is, and other information guides on repatriation or collections. So I've done the hard work for you and it's all there. And one of the other main sections is the Found Something Guidelines for Heritage Finds. Now, this is generally, you're in a paddock, you've discovered your dinosaur bone, who are you meant to call? What are you meant to do? Am I allowed to touch it? What should I do? So these guidelines were created in consultation with 13 experts from paleontology, Indigenous archaeology, and science communication to figure out what are the simplest things we can tell people which will help to better preserve all of this heritage material. They were created to be very easy to understand, so sort of the general pitch level is about 12 years old. So if you're a kid on a beach and you found something, you should be able to understand these guidelines. And they were also created and designed in a variety of formats. So while there is the web page, there's also a brochure, a video, a social media post, and a blog. And this is kind of to cater for different learning styles and different demographics who maybe not everyone is on social media. Maybe people would prefer a printed out brochure, or they'd prefer a website. Now, for two of those formats, the blog and the video, a key tool I used to engage people was storytelling and narrative. Now, you might remember one of the very first slides, I was telling you guys a story of if you found a dinosaur bone, what might you do with it? Now, research has actually shown that when you are listening to or watching or reading a story, it engages a lot of your mental faculties. You're imagining what the bush is like. You're picturing or hearing the sounds of the grass crunching under your feet. You know, your balance and your senses are engaged because you've tripped over, you try and correct yourself. And then mentally thinking about those questions, who would I actually call? What might I actually do if I discovered something? Now, while your brain is imagining all these things and engaging lots of different parts of your brain, it actually reduces your capacity to argue against, intercept, and react to the messages and information that are incoming in this content. So if you were watching something like a lecture, which could be pretty dry, and for example, farmers, a lot of them have a very big fear that if you find Indigenous artefacts or sites on your property, that can be grounds to have your land taken away. This is not true under any legislation in Australia, that can't happen, but it's been a concern that has been perpetuated for decades, and it's still a major reason why people may not be reporting this material. Now, if you're a farmer and you're sitting maybe in an unfamiliar context like this and someone's talking at you, you're potentially more likely to be argumentative about the content, about what's being said. But if you go and have a chat with them down at the pub, you tell them a story, you do it more on their terms, then this is a much more effective way to engage them and deliver this content than a lot of other formats. And using a story like finding a dinosaur bone and how exciting that could be that it's on your property and the history of the land that you currently own, this is another really good gateway to start some of those harder conversations about Indigenous heritage material. So dinosaurs are like the gateway drug into this conversation. Now, while the expert kind of consultation was definitely to create the guidelines, I also took it as an opportunity to see the perspectives and opinions of the experts about the current state of heritage legislation and communication in Australia. And it was wholeheartedly agreed that both the communication to the public and the laws themselves are inadequate in pretty much all states of Australia. And a few quotes from the experts to sum this up was that the problem is not so much with the legislation, but its implementation and regulation. that the onus is on the public to interpret the legislation for themselves, and that no attention has actually been given to communicating this information to the general public. So as all of these sentiments that came together in my creation of the Found a Fossil website to make this information easy to find and accessible to read. So now if you type in "I found a fossil," the Found a Fossil website is pretty much the first thing that comes up on Google. Also, I asked these experts what the benefits of preserving this heritage material was. And so Jason Irving from South Australia mentioned that it's of interest to every Australian to understand what has gone before. Rod from Science Communication Australia, he said that we are likely to be better people when we understand and consider the past. And a little bit of UNE representation from Dr. Phil Bell. Each fossil and artefact is unique and potentially significant, and often the smallest fragment can be revolutionary. And speaking of potentially revolutionary research, my research, hopefully, will be that the survey data can be used to hold state government departments accountable for their poor communication of this heritage legislation and information. And as I mentioned, providing them solutions as well. So a lot of these problems have been known for decades, but no one's actually published about it before. So this is laying some of the groundwork for that. Now, with those 5 formats of the video, the blog, the website, etc., those are actually accessible through the survey at the moment. So there's an optional section where people can opt to watch or read one of these formats and provide feedback on them. And the hope is that I can identify which demographics, maybe the farmers versus Indigenous people versus different age brackets, what formats they actually prefer, and so we can deliver effective and targeted messaging to those groups. So holistically, we can get greater protection of this material. So hopefully from all of that, this will lead to an increased community awareness of their part as stewards of heritage material, that it's not some faraway concept, that this is their local history that they can take part in, and that this will then lead to the greater protection and appreciation of Australian heritage material and the incredible stories that it can tell. And so, to finish, my research will hopefully contribute to the wider heritage conservation discourse and promote the celebration of Australian heritage in all of its different forms. It would be an incredibly sad world without the rich Indigenous cultures and stories and objects that we are privileged to have in this country. And it would be a very, very terrible shame if the next fascinating dinosaur species was lost to science just because someone didn't know who to call. All of this heritage material in Australia contributes to the wider story of the history of life on Earth, and this very much seems like a history worth protecting. Thank you.